What's the difference between living in the UK and living in New Zealand? Aside from being on opposite ends of the globe, there are some other differences that you might notice between living in New Zealand and living in the UK, and that's what I'm going to go through in this video. Hey guys, I'm Laura and I'm originally from the UK and I have lived in New Zealand for about 7 years now, so I think that I kind of have a good idea on telling the difference between the UK and New Zealand. I have lived in various different places in New Zealand on top of that. I've been living in Queenstown, I've lived in Auckland, I've lived in a tiny village called National Park Village near the Tongariro National Park. I've even lived in a camper van for an entire year travelling the country, which is actually on video on this YouTube channel called New Zealand's Biggest Gap Year, where me and my partner, we did 365 days of 365 activities in New Zealand. So that definitely got us around the country in all sorts of nooks and crannies. And now I am based in the central North Island area near Taupo. So on top of that, I've also worked in various different jobs around the country. I've worked in ski fields, done hospitality jobs and worked in airports, but now I'm running NZPocketGuide.com, which is New Zealand's largest travel guide and helps you plan your trip to New Zealand, as well as helps you with these sort of little videos on, living in New Zealand as well. So hopefully you do find this useful if you are thinking of taking the leap of moving from the UK to New Zealand. So I do have a pretty good idea of how life is in New Zealand, but also bear in mind that because I have lived here for 7 years, I've actually spent most of my adult life in New Zealand. I grew up in the UK up until after I graduated university, so if there have been any changes since then, they might, I might miss those sort of things out, although this is a very extensive list. Of course, it will be a little bit biased in certain ways, and I obviously come from the North England. So I don't really know much about living in London, for instance, or the south of England. So if there may be some subtle differences there as well. So just also bear all that in mind. And also, this kind of, when you're talking about the difference between the UK and New Zealand, sometimes it goes into the territory of sounding like you're complaining about how life is in New Zealand, which really isn't the case. I've obviously chosen to live in New Zealand. I obviously think it is better than living in the UK. Sorry, UK, but that's what I've chosen to live. So obviously, I do feel positively about New Zealand. Just the list might sound a little bit negative at times. So just bear that in mind. Okay, let's move on to some of the differences then. Starting with shopping. So I'll talk more about food shopping a little bit after this section, but I'll talk about just more like general going out and needing to get stuff. So in New Zealand, there's slightly less choice for everything. So in terms of clothing, you have less clothing stores, which tend to be more expensive than what you'll find in the UK, but lower quality, I'm afraid. So yeah, finding clothes is kind of like not as easy as in the UK. But the good thing about in New Zealand is that there's not really an emphasis on fashion so much compared to the UK. People are a little bit more laid back and prefer to just sort of dress casually. You don't really often see people in heels or anything like that in New Zealand. So yeah, choosing clothes is also pretty easy because you don't really have to go too trendy or anything. It's quite easy going. But also for if you do want to find a choice and you want to have like variety of different stores and stuff, you usually have to travel quite far to find good shops. For instance, you'll find stores like Kmart, which is like a huge department store, kind of like Wilkinson's in the UK. You usually have to travel to like some of the larger cities like Auckland or Rotorua, Christchurch, for instance. And if you aren't living near those places, then, you know, it's usually quite a mission to go. Yeah, you usually have to go on shopping missions, basically. I found, like, since living in New Zealand, you have to usually plan a day to go somewhere and do all your shopping when you need to, and you don't do that too often. It's not really on your doorstep if you are not living in those cities. There are some different but similar brands in New Zealand compared to the UK. So obviously there's outdoor stores in New Zealand. There's outdoor stores like Kathmandu and Macpac, and you'll see a department store called The Warehouse, which is again similar to Wilkinson's in the UK, or Wilko's. And yeah, so you'll see like similar things, but just under a different brand. It's the same for like food items, like Watties is basically Heinz for baked beans and canned goods. Weet-Bix is called Weet-Bix in New Zealand. I mean, it's really not that different. You're not going to get a major culture shock over here. There's a brand called Pam's, which is like the budget brand in the supermarkets in like Pack and Save and New World, instead of having like, you know, Tesco's own brand or anything like that. So yeah, there's just slight differences there. Everything in New Zealand is a little bit more expensive, so you have to bear in mind that they have to import things from quite far, and there's less competition in New Zealand because, well, the population's lower and it developed, you know, a little later than other developed countries in the world and stuff. So for that reason, that's why prices are a little bit higher. But to counter that, there is the minimum wage in New Zealand is actually higher than in the UK, so you will get paid more for working in New Zealand, but obviously cost of life is a little bit more expensive, so it kind of evens out. Another thing is that shops close about the same time as offices. I think this would be probably more different if you are living like in larger cities in the UK. If you're working in an office, you might be able to go shopping after work, for instance. But in New Zealand, it's kind of like once all the offices are closed at like 5, everything else is closed. So just bear that in mind. Also cafes. Most cafes in New Zealand close at about 3 p.m, so that's quite early. That's not so different than in the north of England in small towns like where I've lived. Usually cafes close quite early in small towns in the UK, but I know cafes like in cities and stuff will stay open till a little bit later, so bear that in mind. And also, most businesses are open on a Sunday in New Zealand, except for banks and the post office, I think, is kind of like the usual thing. Or, I mean, businesses make their own rules, really, but yeah, you can definitely expect to go shopping and stuff like that on a Sunday. It's not a big deal. Okay, let's talk about food shopping, grocery shopping. Everyone's got to eat. For food, there are less choice in supermarket chains. So in the UK, you have a ton of different options for supermarkets. Usually, like even in the small town I was living in the UK, there was like 3 different supermarkets for such a small town, but considering, in New Zealand, I now live in a small town here, and most small towns in New Zealand only really have one choice, and then the larger towns will have 2 choices probably at most. But there's 3 major supermarket chains in New Zealand, which are New World, Pack and Save, and Countdown. And New World and Pack and Save are owned by the same company, and so, I mean, you won't find major price differences there. And so because there's less choice in the supermarket chains, again, that's another reason why things are also a little bit more expensive in New Zealand. This is just a bit of a weird difference that I've noticed, but there's less choice in cream in New Zealand, despite its huge dairy industry. When you want to do various different baking, which I like to do in New Zealand, you have a choice of just like normal cream, which you don't know if it's single or double cream. Like in the UK, you can choose between single and double cream, and you kind of have options. You either have this normal cream or heavy cream, and usually the heavy cream is sold out because people usually want to use it around Christmas to make pavlova, because pavlova is quite a big thing in New Zealand. And yeah, you kind of don't know, it's a little bit confusing at first what sort of cream is what it represents from what you might have seen at home, but turns out just buy the normal cream and it whips up fine. So yeah. Also, another difference in the supermarkets is that spirits aren't sold in supermarkets in New Zealand. You have to go to dedicated liquor stores if you want to buy spirits. You can only buy wine and beer in terms of alcohol in supermarkets, so bear that in mind. And another thing about supermarkets is that they're quite strict on ID. They only accept 3 forms of ID, and that's your passport, your New Zealand driving license, or something they call an 18 plus card, or it's actually now called a Kiwi Access card. So it's like a special card dedicated to being an ID for to show that you're over 18 in New Zealand. So yeah, you can't. I remember in the UK it was maybe a tad bit more casual when it came to supermarket shopping and, you know, buying alcohol and stuff. You could usually use any sort of random ID and it worked. Maybe it's not quite the same like that in the UK anymore, but or maybe in different places in the UK it might be different, but yeah, they are very strict on that in New Zealand, so do bear that in mind. Okay. Oh yes, another huge difference for grocery shopping in New Zealand is that there's a very different type of trolley etiquette. So especially in Pack and Save, you when you go to the cashier, you put yourself, your person, your body in front of the trolley that is full of your groceries, and you unpack your trolley from the front, put it onto the conveyor belts, and then the cashier, when they go, you know, putting it through the checkout, they will then put it in an empty trolley in front of you, and then you basically swap trolleys and take your stuff out of the supermarket from there. It's a little bit confusing at first because, yeah, you know how it's different in the UK. If you're watching this, you probably know how it's different in the UK, but it's a bit confusing at first, and sometimes you feel like you're trapped between trolleys and you don't know what you're supposed to be doing. And another thing is for your basket, if you're just going in a supermarket with a basket, usually in New Zealand, you fill up your basket and then you put the entire basket onto the conveyor belt, and they unload the basket from there, and the cashier will deal to your basket. You don't unload your basket onto the conveyor belt and then you put the basket somewhere under the conveyor belt like you usually do in the UK. Usually the cashier deals with all that. Okay, another thing on my list is only real restaurants, like quite fancy restaurants, will have a waiting service. So basically, when you're going in a cafe or a pub or a bar or maybe a casual restaurant, you have to go to the counter to order your food or your drink, and you have to pay straight away. You don't, basically you don't wait for your order to be taken, because you'll probably be waiting a long time. There's not a huge emphasis on customer service in New Zealand. It is very laid back and casual, so often don't think people are going to bend over for you. Not bend over for you, that's weird. Anyway, another thing in the UK or in New Zealand is that they say the word FPOS instead of debit or credit card. So yeah, FPOS, it means something that I can't remember what it means, but basically it's instead of paying with debit or credit card, they say, do you want to pay with FPOS? And that's what that means, just so you know. And they're more into using credit or debit card in New Zealand compared to paying with cash, a lot more than in the UK. So bear that in mind. But saying that, you still need cash to pay, for instance, if you're using city public transport or maybe going to a food truck, for instance. But you will be surprised at actually how many vendors around New Zealand do use electronic payments, so that's quite cool. Okay, moving on to transport. The difference of transport between the UK and New Zealand. So one major thing is that for a national bus service in New Zealand, there's only one company called Intercity. Everything else are national bus tours, so they're more like tourist things. They're not like, it's not a way to basically commute from A to B. You only really have one company for that, and that's Intercity, or Skip Bus, but Skip is basically Intercity. It's another branch of Intercity. Another thing is that the train network in New Zealand is pretty small. There's only really 3 train lines that are like national train lines. There's commuter trains in Auckland and Wellington, but other than that, getting around the country by train is not really it's not really an option. The 3 train lines that are available are they're just more for like a scenic tourist purpose rather than commuting. Although, yeah, it's pretty easy way. If you want to get between Christchurch and Greymouth, then you might as well take the train because it's also quite cool. Another thing about transport is that most cars in New Zealand are automatic, not manual. So that makes it really easy to drive. If you ever end up stalling on hills like I used to all the time in the UK, that's not really an issue when you have automatic cars. But then there's the problem of once you've lived in New Zealand for a while and then you go back to the UK, then transitioning back to a manual car can be quite hard. Another thing about New Zealand is that the roads are very, very beautiful. They're very scenic. There's lots to see all the time. The scenery changes constantly, even within small drives. So compared to the UK, where you are kind of, you're on your motorway and you don't really see much other than pasture, fields, or cities and stuff. In New Zealand, it's more varied and it's more enjoyable. It's more enjoyable to drive in New Zealand, in my opinion. Another thing is that it takes longer to drive the same distance in New Zealand compared to the UK, mainly because roads, even though they're called highways, some of these highways in New Zealand are actually taking you on winding roads where you do need to slow down. They're usually one-way highways, which is actually getting onto my next point. Maybe I'll just transition on to my next point now, which is that motorways in New Zealand, they're called highways rather than motorways, but motorways are mostly single lane in New Zealand, except for around Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch. So, and in order to overtake people, there are passing lanes, so they come up, every so often. So if you want to overtake someone that's being slow, you either have to wait till it's an appropriate time on the road, or you have to wait till there's a passing lane. Some people might pull over and let you past. That's another difference about drivers in New Zealand, actually, is that tailgating is very common. It's, a lot of people coming from the UK, if, usually a thing in the UK is like if you feel someone's tailgating you, you kind of, put your brakes on to be like, back off. But if you do that in New Zealand, they're probably going to crash into you. So they just drive quite fast in New Zealand. They want to overtake you only to get nowhere because you catch up with them later anyway. Maybe I'm ranting a bit too much about drivers in New Zealand. But yeah, moving on. A good thing about New Zealand is that you can borrow people's cars. Yes, it's the insurance. Insurance is not mandatory in New Zealand, so that's really amazing, I find, because I find that insurance companies in the UK basically control your vehicle, for you. They're basically saying only you can drive this vehicle and you have to get special insurance to share it with people in your family or whatever. That's always been a bit of a pain, I find. But in New Zealand, you can, there's different insurance policies that you can get. It's not mandatory to even get insurance. And you can let people borrow your car and you can borrow your car of people, and that's always really handy. Okay, I'm just going to take a quick sip before moving on to the next point. Yum. The tea is better in the UK though. Although you can get Yorkshire tea in New Zealand, it just costs like $12. Okay, so for work. In New Zealand, the work-life balance is more important than productivity. So it's nice when you are an employee in New Zealand and you can you feel a little more relaxed in your job. That might feel really refreshing if you're coming from a job in the UK where you feel like, it's all go, 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 and it can be really stressful. In New Zealand, that's really unlikely to happen where you're in a stressful job. I feel like everything is quite relaxed. Although, a lot of jobs, whereas in the UK you might be assigned to a job where you have maybe a couple of different roles or a couple of different things you're in charge of. In New Zealand, because of the lack of population, you will probably have to be in charge of a few more things than you're used to. But at the same time, the work culture in New Zealand is quite relaxed, so it kind of doesn't make you feel too stressed. But on the other hand of that, if you are a customer and if you're used to things happening quite quickly and you want you want a quick turnaround on stuff, that's not really likely to happen in New Zealand. They're not super productive. Things can happen quite slowly, so just bear that in mind. Try to not get too stressed. If you want things to happen quickly, you just have to accept that things will happen a bit slowly in New Zealand. Okay, another thing is that the work ethic in New Zealand is quite low. So, people kind of because of this work-life balance, people enjoy their sort of lifestyle side of things more than going to work. So, people aren't really dedicated to their work. They're not a lot of people, it's just the thing they do on the side. So, because of that, if you do have a good work ethic, you will find it easier to find jobs and you'll basically shine at your work. You'll look like the best person ever because everyone else around you is kind of just not really into their job. So you're just if you do like working, then you'll probably stand out pretty well. So that's a positive. Another thing about work is that the minimum wage in New Zealand is quite high. It's higher than in the UK. So that's always a plus, but obviously there are taxes and the cost of living is a little bit higher in New Zealand. So it does kind of balance itself out, but it's still worth mentioning. Okay, moving on to living, houses, your abode, the place you live. So in New Zealand, most of the houses are wooden houses instead of in the UK. It was all sort of brick. That's kind of not favoured in New Zealand because of the risk of earthquakes and that sort of thing. Wooden houses fare better in earthquakes than brick houses, but that's not to say that it's earthquake central over here. They happen kind of, once in a while that you actually feel it. We do have a full video on this channel actually about earthquakes in New Zealand, so go check that out and be reassured that that's not really something that you have to be worried about when you're living in New Zealand. But yeah, coming back to wooden houses, the issue with the houses in New Zealand is that there's little to no insulation. Central heating, this is not how they heat houses in New Zealand compared to in the UK. Instead, they use either log burners or heat pumps or electric heaters. So as you can imagine, heating your home will incur unless you have a log burner, but heating your home it will incur your electricity bill fees will be quite higher. So it can be quite cold also, and double glazing is really rare in New Zealand. So although it does exist and you can get it in your house and stuff, it's just rare. They just didn't originally build some houses in New Zealand with double glazing. So yeah, in conclusion, basically it can be a bit colder in in New Zealand houses compared to in the UK. The airflow's not that great. It's basically they're just not built as well, if I'm allowed to say that. I just don't think they're built as well. So bear that in mind, but there are ways of fixing things. If you do buy a house in New Zealand, you can't get double glazing. You can get insulation, and they are rolling out government sort of schemes where they can get your home insulated for free if you live in a poor neighborhood and that sort of thing. So there are ways to improve on that, but just another thing to bear in mind. Another thing is that the type of washing machines that people seem to favour in New Zealand, or at least they're the type of washing machines that are just popular and around in New Zealand, are the top loader ones. And they tend to destroy your clothes pretty quickly compared to the sort of washing machines you get back home where they're front loaders. So yeah, bear that in mind. Your clothes might get destroyed. Try to save your clothes if you can. The quality of the internet is lower in New Zealand, I find, compared to, basically fibre hasn't been rolled out everywhere in New Zealand yet. I live in a small rural town in New Zealand. We haven't got fibre. It's quite slow, the internet. We have issues uploading videos. It can take all night to upload videos, so it's quite slow, but they are steadily rolling fibre out across the country. But yeah, compared to going to Auckland, like the big cities like Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, they have much better internet. So yeah, it's not everywhere in New Zealand, but just bear that in mind for some more rural areas. Okay, let's talk about New Zealanders, Kiwis, people that come from New Zealand and live in New Zealand. They are relaxed and laid back. That's really cool. They have a relaxed fashion sense. So I did mention that before. It was like in the UK, I feel like people are trying to outdo each other with their clothes. And in New Zealand, nobody really cares. I mean, even when you go out for a night out, like in Auckland and stuff, I remember people going out in their trainers or just like flat shoes and stuff. Like it's quite uncommon to see people wearing like dresses and heels like I used to see in the UK. So I personally find that quite nice. I much prefer that. New Zealanders are also not punctual. So if you're expecting people like your friends or even like professionally, like in business and stuff, if you expect people to arrive places on time, then just don't expect people to arrive up to half an hour later, and even anywhere past half an hour is usually like, okay, they're probably not coming. But usually people sort of take their time, they're not in a rush, and that's just not the way it is. Sometimes people say yes or yeah nah. Yeah nah is a pretty common sort of phrase in New Zealand. So people will say yes or yeah nah, but they actually mean no. So when people just say like yeah or yeah nah, like they mean no. So when people say yes, don't expect them to actually do the thing they said they were going to do or actually agree or whatever. It means no. There's some slight different words in New Zealand compared to the UK. For instance, gumboots, that's your wellies, that's your Wellingtons, so that's the word they have for that. Pants doesn't mean your underwear, it means trousers, so remember that as well. Also in New Zealand, a lot of the place names are Maori place names, and so you'll have to learn how to pronounce them so people understand where you're trying to say. Like, for instance, the letters WH is actually pronounced F in Maori, so bear that in mind. There's other instances of that as well, and we do have an article on nzpocketguide.com going through sort of the basic pronunciation for Maori words, so you'll just have to get used to that as well. Okay, moving on to New Zealand as a whole, like differences between New Zealand and the UK. First of all, the power outlets, they're different. 3-prong in New Zealand like this, even though it's 3-prong in the UK as well, but it's different. It's a different 3-prong, look. So make sure that you have your adapters at the ready. Also, Another thing is due to the low population in New Zealand is that some laws are not often enforced. So doesn't go for everything, but the laws are a little bit more relaxed, basically. So like I've noticed this a lot in consumer laws, for instance. In supermarkets, if you have similar products on the shelves, you sometimes see that the real price is sort of hidden behind it being broke down into kgs or by 100 grams or by piece, for instance. And yeah, so by being hidden behind all these numbers, you kind of actually have to, the price isn't what it is at face value. You need to sort of just be like, okay, so, the family value pack actually might be more expensive per 100 grams than, say, like the normal pack, for instance. So, yeah, you need to kind of be a little bit more savvy on prices, I feel like, in New Zealand compared to in the UK. Another example are the labour laws in New Zealand. So for instance, actually recently, the New World in Wanaka, they chose to stay open on a public holiday. Usually these shops were meant to be closed on this particular public holiday. But they actually decided that they would stay open because, first of all, the fine is minimal. They would make more money in the day anyway. And second of all, it's only if someone reports them, which it actually ended up someone did report them, so it was fine. But basically the consequence to breaking the law is quite minimal for companies. And if you have enough money as a company, then, the law doesn't really apply to you, kind of thing. Also, there's this other aspect of consumer laws or a service where if a company does something wrong, they get quite a few chances to redeem themselves before they have to, for instance, reimburse you, or they have to, or they might get fined or anything. Basically, companies are allowed to get things wrong or do things that are wrong, but they have to be able to get it, they have to be given unlimited chances basically until they get it right. So as a customer, you might have to, if you are unfortunate enough to get, to be doing service or dealings with a dodgy company, then you're kind of on your own. You have to wait for the company to sort it out. And if not, then you just end up losing your money and have to go with someone else. Although you can go to court and stuff, usually it's an expensive process. You don't feel reassured by consumer laws in New Zealand, basically. However, there are some differences. For instance, the Department of Conservation, known as DOC in New Zealand, they're sort of in charge of the national parks, in charge of many campsites and walking tracks throughout the country. They actually enforce some laws, for instance, because they get funding from fines. So if you're found, not paying for a campsite, or if you're found, freedom camping on their land when you're not supposed to or something, then there's people or dock rangers that would usually be enforcing, making sure those laws are enforced. So there are some differences I can think of right now. Okay, let's move on from that boring stuff and talk about the hiking trails in New Zealand. There's many beautiful hiking trails in New Zealand, and they're really well signposted and maintained actual tracks that you can follow, which are very easy compared to in the UK, where you usually have to get your map out or you need to do a bit of planning. It's not usually obvious where you can go for a walk or a hike in the UK in comparison to New Zealand. New Zealand just makes it so much easier, so that's a really good thing about New Zealand. Another thing to talk about is the weather. In New Zealand, I generally find the weather better, although it does change a lot. The temperatures get higher than it does in the UK. but on the other hand, you know, when there's rain, it's a huge downpour. It'll usually be shorter though, and you know, when it's sunny, it's more extreme sort of sunny weather. But compared to in the UK was kind of just like drizzly weather, constant drizzle, dark dreariness, and then the odd sunny day. But yeah, I kind of find the weather in New Zealand a bit more appealing. Another thing though is that the sun in New Zealand is really harsh. It has some of the highest UV levels in the world in New Zealand, so you definitely want to be wearing factor 50. I know in the UK you can easily get away with factor 30 or even factor 15, but definitely not in New Zealand. New Zealand's not a place to just come and, you know, sunbathe in the garden and work on your tan. Okay, another thing about New Zealand is that the nature is awesome. It has some beautiful natural landscapes, beautiful forests, beautiful bird life, and yeah, lots of amazing dramatic landscapes to see. You have huge mountains, you can go skiing on volcanoes. There's all sorts of really different landscapes that you don't get in the UK, so that's a really cool difference. Also, in New Zealand, it is quite multicultural, especially in cities. You will find people from all over the world, and you don't feel like you're the odd one out being a foreigner in New Zealand. Of course, when you get into more rural towns, you're in the towns where there's more Kiwis than there are other nationalities, but there are still often other nationalities. So compared to living in the north of England, where I felt like seeing people from different nationalities often felt quite rare, that's certainly not the case in New Zealand, but I know that's not really the case in like the larger cities in the UK either, but just a subtle difference I noticed coming from the north of England. Okay, so that is everything, I think. Let me just double check my notes. Yes, that is everything. Oh no, there's another one. Yeah, so that's everything. Yeah, so I hope you found that those differences useful and to help you plan your decision if you are thinking about moving to New Zealand. I know it was quite a long video, but I felt like I just wanted to get as many points down as possible. But another really good place for you to learn more about New Zealand is on nzpocketguide.com. It goes through in detail a lot of the different stuff that I've said about, you know, shopping in New Zealand, even healthcare, for instance, like getting a prescription and all that sort of thing. We go through all that on nzpocketguide.com, so make sure to go check that out for more information. And if you do have any comments or questions of your own, put it in the comments below, and I'll be super happy to answer them for you. Or you can also join us on our live Q&A session, which we do on YouTube every single Sunday at 8 a.m. New Zealand time. And that's where you can come and ask your questions in the live chat directly to the team behind nzpocketguide.com. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that video, and I'll see you for the next one.